Welcome to Story Horizon. I'm the storyteller, here to help you drift into a peaceful sleep tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more soothing stories. And let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let yourself relax. Let's begin our journey. Story 1. It was the first week of high school, and everything already felt way too big. The hallways were packed, the teachers expected more, and it seemed like everyone had their group figured out. Everyone except me. My old friends from middle school had gone in different directions, and I hadn't found my place. Then came the incident, the kind that people talked about for days. It all started in math class. We had just started working on a group project, and our teacher, Mr. Jensen, randomly assigned teams. My group was a mix of people I barely knew, including Mike, the soccer star, and Jasmine, who was part of the student council and knew everyone. I felt out of place, to say the least. They talked as if I wasn't even there, laughing at inside jokes while I tried to follow along, feeling more like a spectator than a teammate. As we were about halfway through the project, Mr. Jensen came around to check on us. That's when Mike cracked a joke about something we had been struggling with. And somehow, the conversation shifted, and Jasmine casually mentioned, "Well, at least we're not like Alex over there, always pretending to know everything." She smirked, looking directly at me. I froze. I knew people like Jasmine, popular and effortlessly confident. They could make anyone feel small with just a few words. Pretending to know everything. I repeated, stunned. "I'm just trying to understand like everyone else." Mike chuckled, but I could tell he didn't quite mean it. Jasmine just shrugged. "We all have roles to play," she said. "Maybe just stick to yours." The bell rang, and the rest of the day felt like a blur. I went home, replaying the conversation over and over, trying to figure out if I'd done something wrong. Maybe I had been overconfident. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was actually the problem. The next day, things got worse. A rumor started spreading. Someone had twisted Jasmine's words, making it sound like I'd said something arrogant about our project. By lunchtime, it seemed like everyone had heard. I felt people staring, some even smirking, and I kept hearing whispers when I walked by. I tried to tell myself it would blow over, but each time I thought about it, my heart sank a little more. I felt trapped in a story that wasn't even mine to begin with. As the days went on, I tried to ignore the stares and focus on my work, but the words stayed with me. I began avoiding certain hallways, sitting at the edge of classrooms, keeping my head down to avoid attention. I had never felt so invisible, and at the same time, so exposed. One day, though, something shifted. After class, Mr. Jensen called me over. I was nervous, thinking he might have heard the rumors, but instead, he just looked at me calmly and said, "I noticed you've been a little quiet lately. Everything okay?" I didn't know how to respond at first, but something about the way he asked made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in weeks. So I told him, not everything, but just enough. I mentioned how I felt out of place, and that maybe I'd been too eager, trying to fit in with the wrong people. He listened, nodding, then said something I'll never forget. "High school is like a big stage," he said, "and sometimes we're given a script we didn't choose. But you can always rewrite it, Alex. You don't have to play a role that doesn't feel like you." Hearing that felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to be defined by what others thought or said. The next day, I walked into school with my head a little higher, determined to write my own story, not just the one others had created for me. Story 2. I boarded the train just as the sky was starting to turn that beautiful shade of dusk, the kind that makes everything feel a little softer, a little more magical. I'd spent the weekend visiting friends in the city, and while the time had been fun, I felt that familiar pull of wanting to be back home. There's something comforting about the quiet hum of a train journey in the evening, where you're just a passenger in a steel car carrying you along the tracks, away from the busy city lights and closer to someplace familiar. The train car wasn't too crowded, just a few people scattered here and there. I found a window seat, settled in, and leaned my head back, feeling the rhythm of the wheels beneath me. Outside, the city's high-rises began to fade, replaced by fields and forests, each scene slipping past like chapters in a book. There's something about watching the world blur by outside that always makes me feel like time is slowing down, like life itself is taking a moment to breathe. A couple of rows ahead, an elderly couple sat close together, pointing out the window at the passing scenery. Every so often, the woman would reach over, gently patting the man's arm, as if to say, "Did you see that?" I could hear bits of their soft laughter and occasional snippets of conversation. It made me smile. They had the warmth and familiarity of two people who'd shared a lifetime together. Across the aisle, a young man in a hoodie was lost in his headphones, nodding along to a rhythm only he could hear. He looked around my age, but there was a weight to his gaze, a tiredness in his posture that told a story. He'd catch glimpses of the scenery every now and then, and I wondered if he too was heading home, or maybe running away from something. As the train continued its journey, the sky turned a deeper blue, and a calm darkness settled over everything. The lights inside the train dimmed, casting a gentle glow. Outside, a few distant houses appeared, their windows glowing softly, like beacons of warmth. I started imagining the lives behind those windows. Families gathered for dinner, children laughing, someone reading a book in a cozy armchair. A soft announcement crackled over the speaker, signaling the next stop. An elderly man, sitting a few seats back, gathered his things. He had one of those old leather suitcases, well worn with memories. As he shuffled past me, he gave a small nod, a simple acknowledgement that we were all sharing this moment together, however brief. Watching him step off the train and blend into the shadows of the platform felt like watching a character walk out of a story. The train started moving again, and I found myself drifting, lulled by the steady sway and the gentle rumble of the tracks. I must have closed my eyes for a bit, because when I opened them, we were passing a small river. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting a silver path that seemed to go on forever. It was one of those quiet moments that just feels right, like the universe is letting you know that, no matter how chaotic life gets, there are still pockets of peace if you look for them. The young man across the aisle had also noticed the river. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and he nodded with a faint smile, as if to say, "Yeah, this is nice, isn't it?" There was no need for words, just a shared appreciation for the fleeting beauty outside the window. The journey felt timeless, a little world within itself, moving forward, yet suspended in a kind of stillness. Outside, the towns grew smaller, the lights fewer and farther apart, until it was mostly fields bathed in moonlight. I thought about how the end of a journey always feels like waking up from a dream. You're grateful for the experience, but there's a part of you that wishes it could last just a little longer. As we approached the final station, people around me began to stir, gathering bags and adjusting coats. The elderly couple held hands, ready to step off together into the night. The young man across the aisle took off his headphones, stretching a bit before he reached for his backpack. He caught my eye again, and we exchanged a small nod, a silent goodbye to a fellow traveler. The train came to a gentle stop, and I stepped out onto the platform, feeling the cool night air brush against my face. There was a quietness here, a familiar silence that welcomed me back. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world ease just a little, knowing that home was only a short walk away. As the train pulled away, I watched it disappear into the distance, carrying with it the lives, stories, and quiet connections of everyone on board. For just a moment, we had all shared that journey together, each of us heading somewhere different, but for a few hours, part of the same moving world. The night was still, and the stars were shining, and with a calm heart and a grateful mind, I began the last leg of my journey home. Story 3. People always ask me what it's like working the night shift. Isn't it lonely? Aren't you exhausted? They say. And while, yes, it can be tiring, there's something about the hospital at night that feels peaceful, almost like a world unto itself. The hospital is a different place after dark. The bustling hallways that are alive with activity during the day become quiet, dimly lit, with only the hum of machines and the occasional whisper between nurses and doctors. As a night shift nurse, I've come to know that quiet well. It's the kind of calm that lets you hear your own thoughts, or maybe even feel a bit of magic in the air. One night, I was making my rounds on the pediatric ward. There was a little girl named Ellie who had been with us for weeks, undergoing treatment for leukemia. She was maybe 6, with big brown eyes and a smile that could light up a whole floor. That night, as I walked past her room, I saw her sitting up in bed, wide awake, clutching her teddy bear to her chest. She noticed me and gave a tiny wave. I walked over, keeping my voice soft. "Can't sleep, Ellie." She shook her head, then whispered, "Can you tell me a story?" There was something about her request that made my heart ache a bit, but I sat down beside her, and we spent a few quiet minutes in our own little world. I made up a story on the spot, one about a brave little girl who explored the stars with her trusty bear by her side. Ellie listened with wide eyes, and when I finished, she was fast asleep, her teddy bear held close. Moments like that make the night shift worth every second. Later that night, I found myself on the oncology floor. It's always a bit heavy there, especially at night. Patients tend to get restless in the early hours, and you can feel a kind of unspoken sadness hanging in the air. But it's also where some of the most tender moments happen. Mr. Wilkins, one of our longtime patients, had trouble sleeping most nights, so I often found myself sitting with him, just chatting about life, his family, his love for jazz. That night, he had an old record player by his bedside. He'd managed to convince his daughter to bring it in. We sat in silence as he played one of his favorite records, the soft notes filling the empty room and echoing down the silent hallways. He told me about how he and his late wife used to dance to this very song, back when they were young and carefree. His eyes were closed, a gentle smile on his face, as if he were right back in those memories. In that quiet room, I could almost see them. 2 young people swaying to the rhythm, laughter in their eyes. It's moments like these that feel almost sacred, like time itself has slowed down. Around 3 a.m., we get what we call the witching hour. It's the time when even the machines seem to hum a little softer, when the whole hospital seems to breathe. Most of the patients are asleep, and we check on them in near silence, moving gently so as not to disturb the peace that has settled over everything. On my way back to the nurse's station, I peeked into the NICU, the tiniest patients we have, their little chests rising and falling with each breath, surrounded by the soft beeps of monitors. There's a quiet resilience in that room, a strength so small you could miss it if you weren't looking close enough. My shift was almost over, and the first hints of dawn began to glow faintly through the windows. The day nurses would be arriving soon, and the hospital would stir back to life, the quiet moments of the night fading as the sunlight filled the rooms. But as I gathered my things and headed toward the exit, I took one last look down the hallway, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Walking out into the cool morning air, I felt tired, yes, but also fulfilled. People don't often see the beauty in the night shift, the gentle connections, the shared stories, the quiet courage. but I know it's there. It's in the little moments, the soft conversations, the hands held in silence. And as I stepped into my car, ready to head home and sleep through the day, I thought about Ellie, about Mr. Wilkins, about the newborns in the NICU. I thought about all the small acts of care that fill those nighttime hours and the privilege of being there, a witness to it all. Story 4. The rain started just as I turned the corner onto Maple Street. A light drizzle at first, then suddenly a downpour. I had no umbrella, of course, and no desire to sprint down the street like everyone else. So I ducked into a small, tucked-away bookstore to wait it out. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as I entered, and the warmth of the place wrapped around me like a cozy blanket. It was dim inside, with the soft glow of lamps casting a gentle light over the shelves. The air smelled of old paper, a little dust, and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon and vanilla. The store had that kind of quiet you only find in bookstores or libraries. A respectful hush that makes you slow down and breathe a little deeper. I wandered between the shelves, listening to the soft patter of the rain on the windows, as if the store itself were part of the storm. There were only a few other people scattered around. A man in a tweed jacket flipping through a thick, old book. A young woman wrapped in a colorful scarf, browsing the poetry section. And the bookseller, a kind-looking man with silver hair and round glasses perched on his nose, carefully rearranging books on a high shelf. The store had that magical quality of being both cozy and endless, like it could go on forever. Every nook and corner held shelves filled with books of every kind. I started picking up random ones, novels, travel guides, an ancient cookbook with handwritten notes in the margins. Each book felt like a tiny world waiting to be discovered. I eventually made my way to the back of the store, where a little reading nook was tucked away, complete with a faded armchair and a small table holding a stack of books left behind by previous readers. I chose a slim, well-worn novel and sank into the armchair, listening to the rain while flipping through the first few pages. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, it felt like time had slowed, and the world had shrunk to the pages in my hands and the quiet sounds of the bookstore. After a while, the woman in the colorful scarf joined me in the nook, sitting across from me with a thick book of poetry. She caught my eye and smiled, a small, shared moment between strangers. "There's no better place to wait out a storm than a bookstore," she said softly, her voice warm and friendly. I nodded, feeling that rare, comfortable silence that happens between people who are both content to be exactly where they are. We didn't need to talk. The store itself seemed to hold enough stories for both of us. Time drifted, and I lost myself in the book, pausing now and then to listen to the rain. People came and went, each one leaving behind a trace of their presence, a faint perfume, a soft laugh, a quiet whisper as they asked the bookseller for a recommendation. At one point, the man in the tweed jacket approached the bookseller, holding a book up to him with a reverent smile. "I've been looking for this one for years," he said, his voice filled with the kind of joy only a book lover would understand. The bookseller smiled back, clearly pleased. "That one's special," he replied. "A first edition." It was a simple exchange, yet it felt like witnessing something sacred. As the rain began to ease, the woman in the scarf closed her poetry book and looked up, catching my eye again. She held up the book, smiling. "This one's a keeper. I'll have to come back for it." She left with a wave, her bright scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon of color in the otherwise muted store. Eventually, I stood up too, stretching and carefully putting my book back on the shelf, feeling as if I were leaving behind a piece of myself. I wandered back to the front, where the bookseller was still busy with his shelves. He looked up and smiled as I approached. "Find something you liked?" he asked, a twinkle in his eye. "I did," I replied. "I think I'll be back for it." As I stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle mist, leaving the streets shiny and fresh. The world felt different somehow, as if the storm had washed away not just the dirt and dust, but something deeper, leaving everything a little brighter, a little more alive. Walking away from the bookstore, I felt that familiar ache of leaving a good story behind, but also a quiet thrill knowing it would still be there, waiting for me on the shelf whenever I needed it. And maybe, the next time it rains, I'll find myself back in that cozy nook, waiting out the storm with a book in hand, surrounded by the soft sounds of pages turning and the comforting hush of Story 5. I never thought I'd spend so much time in a garden, but every time I visited Grandma, we'd end up there, side by side, surrounded by rows of flowers and vegetables, the scent of earth and fresh herbs filling the air. I used to think gardening was just her hobby, but over time, I realized it was her sanctuary. One evening, as the sun began to dip, casting the entire garden in shades of gold and pink, Grandma handed me a small trowel. "Come on," she said with a gentle smile. "Help me with these tomatoes." Her hands were steady and weathered, moving expertly, with the kind of care that only comes from years of tending to something you love. I watched her, mimicking her movements, and tried to soak up every detail of her quiet wisdom. Her garden wasn't huge, but it was a masterpiece. There were rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, and lettuce, with sunflowers towering in the back, their faces turned toward the last rays of sunlight. In between, she tucked in little patches of marigolds and lavender, for color and company, as she liked to say. A row of basil and rosemary lined the path, and every time the breeze picked up, it carried their sharp, comforting scent through the air. We worked in silence for a bit, with only the sound of birds settling in for the night and the soft rustle of leaves. Then Grandma broke the quiet with one of her stories. "You know," she began, pulling a weed from the soil, "I didn't have my own garden until I was almost 40. Before that, I only had a few plants on my windowsill." She chuckled, shaking her head as if at a fond memory. "What changed?" I asked, intrigued. She had so many stories tucked away, and I knew each one held a lesson if you listened close enough. She paused, her gaze drifting over the rows of vegetables and flowers. "Your grandpa," she said softly. "When we moved here, he helped me turn this patch of land into a garden. We'd work out here every evening, just like this, until the stars came out." I smiled, imagining the two of them, younger versions of the grandparents I knew, side by side in this very spot. I could almost feel their laughter lingering in the air. There was something so grounding about being in the same place they had, doing the same work, feeling connected to them in a way that words couldn't quite express. As we continued to work, she pointed out different plants, each with its own story. "These roses over here," she said, gesturing to a row of pale pink blooms. "Your mother planted them when she was about your age. She was convinced they'd never grow. But look at them now, stronger every year. We moved to the herbs next, and she let me snip sprigs of basil and thyme, showing me how to be gentle so the plant would keep growing. She ran her fingers over a rosemary bush, a smile on her face. "Rosemary for remembrance," she said, almost to herself. "Every time I smell it, I think of old friends, family gatherings, and Sunday dinners." The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the garden, and the golden light seemed to bring everything to life. The tomato plants glowed red and green. The marigolds looked like little suns themselves, and the lavender swayed, filling the air with its calming scent. Grandma dusted off her hands and sighed content. "You know, gardening teaches you a lot about patience," she said, "and resilience. These plants, they go through storms, pests, dry spells, but with a little care, they bounce back. We stood there in silence, both of us soaking up the last warmth of the day. She reached over, gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear, and I felt the quiet strength in her touch, a strength built from years of nurturing life in this garden and in her family. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, we gathered our tools, the day's work done. Grandma took one last look at her garden, her eyes soft with pride and love. "It's funny," she said, more to herself than to me, "how you can plant something so small and watch it grow, season after season. Just takes a bit of care and patience." Walking back to the house, I looked at her. This woman who seemed to carry so much in her heart, yet shared it with such quiet grace. I realized that the garden was more than just a place for vegetables and flowers. It was a place where she had poured her love, her memories, her life. And now, she was passing a little bit of that on to me. I knew I'd be back, again and again, learning from her, sharing these golden evenings, and tending to the life she'd built. And maybe one day, I'd have my own little garden, carrying forward the lessons she taught me under those sunset skies. Story 6. It was one of those nights when the world felt too loud, and sleep seemed like a distant dream. I found myself wandering through the quiet streets, searching for something. I didn't know what, exactly. Just something to fill the silence in my head. That's when I stumbled upon the late-night cafe, a tiny place tucked between closed shops, its windows glowing warmly under the streetlights. The neon sign above the door simply read "Open," flickering slightly, inviting yet unassuming. I pushed open the door, and a soft bell chimed, breaking the stillness of the night. Inside, the cafe was dimly lit and quiet, like it had been waiting for someone to come along. The barista looked up with a small smile. "Just coffee?" she asked, her voice a gentle murmur, like she knew what kind of night it was. I nodded, and as she set to work, I glanced around. There were only a few other people scattered across the cafe, a mix of strangers, each wrapped up in their own late-night stories. In the corner, an elderly man sat alone, a book in one hand and a steaming cup in the other. His eyes scanned the pages slowly, as if savoring each word. I wondered what had brought him here, at this hour, in this little cafe. Next to him was a worn leather bag, filled with papers and notes, his pen poised on the table. Maybe he was a writer, or someone with too many thoughts, finding peace in the quiet company of words. A young woman sat a few tables away, her hands wrapped around her mug as she stared out the window, lost in thought. She looked like she'd come from a long day, her hair pulled back, and her eyes a little tired. She seemed to be waiting for something, or someone, her gaze distant yet soft, like she was replaying memories only she could see. My coffee arrived, and I took a sip, letting the warmth fill me up from the inside. There's something about coffee late at night. It doesn't really keep you awake. It just lets you linger in the stillness a little longer. The cafe felt like a pocket of time, a place where everyone's reasons for being there didn't matter. We were simply together, sharing a moment of quiet that somehow felt like comfort. The barista moved about the space with a familiar ease, like she knew the routine of late-night souls. Every now and then, she'd check on someone, her presence subtle yet warm, a silent reassurance that this space was here for anyone who needed it. I caught a glimpse of a couple sitting by the window, leaning close together. They spoke in hushed voices, sharing secrets, laughter, and smiles that only the other could understand. They looked like they were on the brink of something new, a love just beginning to unfold. It was almost like they'd forgotten anyone else was there, lost in their own world. Around 2 a.m., a young man with a guitar case slung over his shoulder walked in, shaking the rain from his coat. He ordered a drink, then settled into a corner booth, placing the guitar carefully beside him. He looked weary, but content, and after a few sips, he started strumming quietly, filling the cafe with a soft melody that felt like it belonged there, like he was playing just for us. I leaned back in my seat, feeling a calmness settle over me. It was a rare kind of comfort, being in a room full of strangers who didn't ask for anything, who simply shared the night with you. There was a sense of connection, a warmth that went beyond words. Eventually, the elderly man packed up his book and papers, tucking them carefully into his bag before he stood and gave the barista a small nod of thanks. The young woman by the window glanced at her phone and sighed, taking one last look out into the night before she left. The couple finished their drinks, still holding hands as they walked out together, exchanging soft smiles. One by one, the cafe emptied, each person leaving quietly, as if not wanting to disturb the peace we'd all found here. By the time I finished my coffee, I was the last one there, aside from the barista, who was cleaning up with that same gentle grace. "Thanks," I said, unsure how to put into words what this little cafe had given me. She just nodded, her smile understanding, as if she'd heard that unspoken gratitude 100 times before. "Come back anytime," she replied, and I knew she meant it. This place would be here, waiting, like a friend who always leaves the light on. As I stepped back into the night, the rain had stopped, and the air felt fresh, washed clean. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter somehow, the noise in my head a little quieter. The late-night cafe was just a small place in a big city, but it held a magic of its own. Refuge for anyone seeking a little warmth and understanding in the middle of the night. Walking home, I thought about the others who had shared that space with me, each of us strangers, yet connected in that quiet, fleeting way. We'd found a moment of peace in each other's company, a soft place to land in the middle of the night. And I knew, whenever I needed it, that cafe would be there, a sanctuary in the heart of the city, where the light is always on, and the coffee is warm. Story 7. The library was quiet, the kind of stillness that only settles in once the final patron has left, and the only sound is the soft hum of the heating vents. I looked around the familiar rows of shelves, each one holding years of memories and countless stories, and realized that this was my last hour before retirement. 32 years as the town's librarian, and now it was time to turn the page. It was just me and the books now, my lifelong companions. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passing minutes. With a deep sigh, I took my usual walk through the library, savoring the feel of the soft carpet underfoot, the faint smell of old paper, and the quiet solitude that always made this place feel like home. I started in the children's section, where vibrant picture books lined the lower shelves. So many faces flashed through my mind, children whose tiny hands had reached for their first books, their eyes wide with wonder. There was Jake, who used to pick the same dinosaur book every week, and Lily, who would sit cross-legged by the window with a stack of fairy tales. Now there were adults, some of them even bringing their own children here. I ran my fingers along the spines, each one a piece of someone's memory, someone's first adventure. I moved along to the teen section, where worn paperbacks and graphic novels filled the shelves. It was here that I'd watched young minds grow, their interests evolving with each year. I remembered Emily, who found solace in fantasy novels when life got tough at home, and Marcus, who spent countless hours reading comics, dreaming of becoming an artist. I always tried to keep a special place for those kids, the ones who needed an escape, a friend in the pages of a book. The clock ticked on, reminding me that my time here was almost up, but I didn't rush. I wanted to drink in every corner, every memory, one last time. Next, I reached the mystery and thriller section, one of my favorites. Over the years, I'd recommended countless novels to the regulars who craved a good puzzle or suspenseful chase. There was Mr. Thompson, who would come in every Friday, searching for his next whodunit. I remember how he'd always give me his theories, animatedly guessing the killer halfway through each book, and then return the next week to see if he'd been right. I chuckled to myself, thinking of all those conversations, each one a little story in itself. Finally, I walked toward the quietest corner, the back of the library where the classics and poetry lived. It was a special place, a refuge for those who came looking for a different kind of connection. I could almost see Mrs. Nguyen sitting there, always with a slim volume of poetry in her hands, her eyes lighting up whenever she found a line that touched her soul. And, of course, I remembered Mr. Patel, who spent hours with the old philosophy books, leaving little slips of paper with quotes he loved between the pages. With a smile, I took down one of those poetry books and opened to a random page. The words felt like a goodbye letter, gentle and bittersweet. It reminded me of how, in some way, every book was a conversation, one that spanned years, places, and even lifetimes. And I'd been lucky enough to be part of those conversations for so long. The clock read 5:57. Just 3 minutes left. I made my way back to the front desk, feeling a lump in my throat that was both happy and sad. The library was closing, but it wasn't just the end of the day. It was the end of an era, my era. As I locked up for the last time, I took one final look around. Every shelf, every book, every quiet corner held a story, not just in the words on the pages, but in the memories we'd all made together. I thought of all the people who'd walked through these doors over the years, each one carrying a piece of this place with them, just as I would carry it with me. I turned off the lights, casting the library into a gentle darkness, and stepped outside. The air was cool, filled with the scent of autumn leaves, and the sky was a soft blue-gray, with the first stars beginning to peek through. I closed the door with a sense of peace, knowing that the library would always be here, waiting for the next chapter, the next story, the next soul seeking a place to belong. As I walked away, I felt lighter, leaving behind a piece of myself, but taking with me a lifetime of stories, friendships, and the quiet magic that only a library can hold. And with each step, I knew that I'd always have a place here, in the heart of 1,000 stories, even if my last hour had come and gone. Story 8. It started as a simple habit, something I did on Sunday afternoons, just to clear my head. There was a park a few blocks from my apartment, with a row of benches under a line of old oak trees. One bench in particular, the second from the end, became my spot. I'd sit there with a coffee in hand, watching the world drift by. But over time, I realized I wasn't the only one who felt drawn to that bench. One warm spring day, as I was settling in, an older gentleman sat down beside me. He wore a flat cap and had a kind, weathered face, the kind that looked like it had a story or two. After a few moments of comfortable silence, he gave a polite nod and said, "Lovely day, isn't it?" I nodded back. "It really is." And just like that, a tradition began. His name was Mr. Alvarez, and he'd been coming to the park every Sunday for years. Each week, he shared a story, sometimes about his late wife, whom he'd met during a summer carnival decades ago, or about his days as a jazz musician. I learned about the band he traveled with, the smoky clubs he'd played in, the songs he missed. Listening to him, it felt like he was bringing those days back to life, one memory at a time. The next person I met was a young woman named Sarah. She came one afternoon, her face flushed, clearly upset. She took a seat at the other end of the bench, staring into the distance. After a while, I broke the silence. "Rough day." She looked over at me, hesitant, then nodded. "Job interview didn't go so well," she said with a half-hearted shrug. "I thought I'd nailed it. But She trailed off, looking away. I offered a sympathetic smile and told her about the worst job I'd ever applied for, where I'd spent the entire interview spilling coffee on myself and tripping over my words. To my surprise, she laughed, the tension in her face softening. For the next few Sundays, she'd pop by, sometimes telling me about a new job lead, other times just venting about life in the city. We'd share a few laughs, a few quiet moments, and then she'd head off, her spirit a little lighter. Then there was Mr. Patel, a retired teacher who'd often stop by with a bag of seeds to feed the pigeons. He had a gentle way about him, patient and kind, and he always had a story ready. One Sunday, he told me about his first classroom, a small room in an old brick building, with creaky floors and desks that wobbled. I had 30 students that year, he said, smiling softly. Bright-eyed kids, so eager to learn. Some of them still visit me, you know. They're all grown now, with kids of their own. We spent many afternoons in comfortable silence, watching the pigeons gather at his feet, listening to the soft rustling of the trees. I learned more about him through his quiet gestures, his care for the birds, his thoughtful pauses between words. He was a man who had given much and asked for little, content just to sit on a park bench and enjoy the passing seasons. One afternoon, as autumn was settling in, a mother and her little girl joined me on the bench. The little girl, no more than 4, held a book in her hands, clutching it tightly, as if it were a treasure. Her mother smiled apologetically. She insisted on stopping here to read, she said. I smiled back. It's a good spot for it. The little girl opened her book, and I watched her tiny finger trace along the words as she whispered them aloud, her voice soft and serious. Her mother and I exchanged a smile, both of us sharing a quiet pride in her enthusiasm. Each Sunday after that, they'd return, sometimes bringing a new book, sometimes the same one. Watching her read, I saw the beginnings of a lifetime love for stories, and it reminded me of all the joy books had brought me. As the seasons passed, the people who visited the bench changed with the weather, each bringing their own story, their own piece of life. Some came once and never returned. Others became familiar faces. There was the teenager with the skateboard who was always practicing tricks in the distance but would occasionally sit and ask me about life, college, or whatever was on his mind. There was the jogger who'd stop for a breather, always cheerful, always with a funny story to share about something he'd seen on his run. I don't know what drew people to that bench, but over time, it became a place where strangers could find a moment of connection, a small reprieve from the rush of life. And each Sunday, as I sat there, I realized that those simple conversations, shared stories, laughs, and moments of quiet understanding were something I'd started to look forward to more than anything else. When winter finally came, and the air turned cold, the park grew quiet. The bench sat empty most days, waiting for spring. But even in the cold, I'd sometimes find my way there, my scarf wrapped tightly, and think about all the people who had shared that spot with me, if only for a moment. Each story, each conversation, became part of that bench, part of the park, and as I watched the bare branches sway against the gray sky, I knew that come spring, there would be more stories to hear, more people drawn to that simple park bench, and I'd be there, ready to listen, grateful for the small yet profound connections found in those quiet conversations. Story 9. There's something magical about arriving at the farmer's market just as the sun begins to peek over the horizon. The air is cool, and the stalls are being set up, each one bursting with colors and textures that only fresh produce can have. I love getting there early, when the market is just waking up and the vendors are chatting with each other, swapping stories from their farms and gardens. My favorite stand is always the first one on the left, run by Mr. Harris, a man in his 60s with a wide-brimmed hat and a grin that makes you feel like an old friend. Every week, His stall is loaded with bright red tomatoes, freshly picked greens, and carrots so vibrant they practically glow. He always remembers his regulars, and he greets me with a hearty morning sunshine that somehow makes the day feel brighter. "Got some heirloom tomatoes just for you," he says, lifting a few to show me. "Best ones in the bunch. They're plump and warm from the sun, and I can practically taste the sweetness already." I thank him, tossing a few into my basket, feeling the weight of the fresh produce as a comforting reminder of the simple joy of good food. Next, I wander over to the flower stall, run by a young woman named Lila. She arranges bundles of wildflowers, sunflowers, and delicate dahlias into neat, colorful bunches. Lila's flowers are always beautiful, but there's something more. Each bouquet looks like a little piece of art. She catches my eye as I reach for a bundle of wildflowers, giving me a warm smile. "Those are fresh from the field this morning," she says, her hands moving deftly as she ties another bouquet. "They'll last you all week." I take her word for it, imagining how they'll brighten my kitchen table, bringing a bit of the market's magic home. The scent of freshly baked bread draws me to a stall run by a cheerful woman named Carla, who always wears a red apron dusted with flour. Her display is lined with rustic loaves, braided challah, and flaky croissants that look too perfect to eat. She notices me eyeing the challah and winks. "Baked it at sunrise. Still warm if you want a piece," she says, tearing off a bit and handing it to me. The bread is soft, slightly sweet, and melts in my mouth, a perfect treat to start the morning. As I'm savoring the bread, I notice a little boy tugging at his father's sleeve, pointing excitedly at a stall filled with jars of honey and homemade jam. I follow them over, watching as the vendor, an elderly beekeeper named Mr. Lee, lets the boy sample a bit of honey on a wooden stick. The boy's eyes light up as he tastes it, and Mr. Lee chuckles, telling him about the bees that made it, how they worked all summer to fill each jar. The father buys a jar, thanking Mr. Lee, and they move on, the boy clutching the honey like it's a treasure. Across the way, I spot the vegetable stall run by Maria and her husband, both of them busy arranging their produce into perfect rows. Their stall has everything: zucchinis, bell peppers, onions, and rows of leafy greens that look freshly plucked from the earth. Maria gives me a quick wave, her hands full of bright red bell peppers. "Try these," she calls, handing me one. They're as sweet as candy. I take a bite, and she's right. The flavor is crisp and bright, a reminder of why I keep coming back here, where food tastes like it should. The morning slips by, and the market gets busier, filled with families, couples, and people like me, here for the simple pleasure of picking fresh produce and connecting with the people who grew it. Each stall has its own charm, its own story, and by the time I filled my basket, I feel like I've been on a mini journey around the farms and fields of our town. As I make my way toward the exit, I pass an elderly man playing a fiddle by the market's entrance, his tunes lively yet soothing. People toss coins into his hat, some pausing to listen as they smile and sway to the music. There's a young couple dancing, and a little girl claps along, her laughter mixing with the melody. It feels like a perfect ending to the morning, a small reminder of the joy in shared moments, simple pleasures, and community. Before I leave, I take a last look around. The colorful stalls, the friendly faces, the scents and sounds all blending into a comforting, familiar scene. Each week, it's the same market, the same people. Yet somehow, it always feels new, filled with surprises and small wonders. With a full basket and a lighter heart, I head home, already looking forward to the next Saturday, knowing that the market will be waiting, ready to welcome me back with open arms, the way only a place of true warmth and community can. Story 10. T's funny how a walk home can become its own little ritual, something you do so often it feels like an old friend. For as long as I can remember, I've walked the same path from the bus stop to my front door, past the same houses, trees, and small town sights that have become a kind of comfort to me. Every evening, no matter the season, I take that familiar path home, and each step has its own quiet story. The path starts at the corner of Elm and Maple, right by Mrs. Donnelly's house. She's this sweet, elderly woman who always waves from her front porch. In summer, she's out watering her flower beds, dressed in her straw hat and gardening gloves, a glass of iced tea beside her. She always calls out, "Home from work," with a knowing smile. I wave back, giving her a nod, and sometimes she'll share a quick story about her grandkids or her garden. On days when I'm particularly tired, her friendly wave feels like the welcome home gesture I didn't even know I needed. A little further down the street is the small bakery run by Mr. Chun. He keeps the door open in the evenings to let the smell of fresh bread drift out, and I swear, that warm, yeasty aroma is enough to make anyone feel like they're already home. Occasionally, he'll step outside and chat with a few of the regulars waiting for their favorite pastries to finish baking. When I stop by for a loaf or a cookie, he always tells me, "Bread's best when it's fresh." I can't help but agree, especially when the loaf is still warm in my hands. As I continue, I pass the park where kids are often still playing, their laughter ringing out, filling the air with a kind of joy that only seems to exist in the early evening. There's usually a game of tag happening, kids darting between swings and slides, their voices high-pitched and carefree. Sometimes I slow down just to listen, watching as parents start to round them up, herding them home for dinner. It reminds me of my own childhood, when I'd play until dusk, reluctantly heading inside only when the streetlights came on. Further along, there's the small pond at the edge of the park, where I always see Mr. Jenkins, an older gentleman who spends his evenings feeding the ducks. He's a quiet presence, but he has a certain contentment about him, tossing breadcrumbs into the water as the ducks paddle over eagerly. Every now and then, he'll nod at me, a wordless acknowledgement that feels like part of the routine. I often wonder what brings him back each day. Maybe he's just as attached to his path as I am to mine. Just as the path begins to turn towards my street, there's a little bookstore tucked between two brick buildings. The owner, Nina, keeps the lights low and the door open, her shelves filled with well-loved novels and the occasional rare find. She's usually leaning on the counter, reading herself, but she always looks up with a smile if I happen to stop in. She once told me, "Books and neighborhoods, they're both best when they're familiar." It's one of those things that stuck with me. Sometimes I grab a book to read at home, and sometimes just seeing the cozy glow of the bookstore is enough. As I near my own street, I pass by the houses of neighbors I know by sight and by habit. The Millers are usually outside, their two dogs barking playfully as I walk by. Mr. Miller gives me a wave while trying to wrangle the dogs, and I can't help but laugh at the chaos. There's a comfort in the predictability of it, in knowing that tomorrow will probably look just the same. Finally, I reach my own front gate. The paint slightly chipped and the hinges a bit rusty, but that too is part of the charm, part of the familiar. I take a deep breath, looking back down the path I've walked 1,000 times. It's just a simple route through a quiet neighborhood, but it feels like so much more. A little journey that brings me back to myself, one step at a time. As I open the door to my house, I'm met with the smell of dinner, the soft hum of the radio in the kitchen, and the warmth that only home can bring. It's the end of a long day, and yet the walk has made it feel lighter, made it feel like I'm exactly where I need to be. Maybe one day, I'll walk a different path, find myself somewhere new. But tonight, I'm grateful for every familiar sight, every friendly face, and every little moment along the way that turns a simple walk into something more. A welcome home that goes beyond words. Story 11. There's something about the ocean at sunset that feels like a gentle reminder to slow down, to take a deep breath, and let the day's worries drift away with the waves. Every so often, when I feel the need to escape from the rush of everyday life, I find myself heading down to the shoreline for an evening walk. It's become a ritual, my own little retreat. The beach is quieter at this hour, with only a few people scattered along the sand, most of them in that same reflective state. I start my stroll near the pier, where the shadows are long, and the air is filled with the soft murmurs of the sea. The golden light spills over everything, casting the world in shades of orange and pink, and it feels like stepping into a painting. As I walk, my toes sinking into the cool sand, I see an elderly couple just ahead of me, their hands intertwined as they move slowly along the shore. They're not talking. They're simply walking in silence, completely in tune with each other, as if they've done this 1,000 times. There's something so peaceful, so grounded about them, that I can't help but smile as I pass by. They give me a gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement that we're all here, sharing this moment of quiet magic by the sea. Further down, I spot a young girl with a kite, her laughter ringing out as she chases it through the sand. The kite dances in the breeze, a splash of color against the fading sky, and her joy is contagious. Her parents are nearby, watching with that kind of soft, tired love you see at the end of a long day. They wave to me as I walk by, and I wave back, feeling the warmth of simple human connection, even if it's fleeting. I continue along the shore, watching as the waves roll in and out, each one leaving a trace on the sand before retreating back into the sea. The sound is steady, rhythmic, like nature's own lullaby. It's a reminder that time moves in cycles, that everything ebbs and flows, and it brings a quiet comfort that I can feel settling into my bones. As the sun dips lower, I notice a young man sitting on a large rock, his sketchbook balanced on his knee, completely absorbed in his work. He's sketching the horizon, his pencil moving quickly, capturing the way the light hits the water. I stop for a moment to watch him, admiring his focus, his dedication to preserving this fleeting moment. He catches my gaze and smiles briefly before returning to his drawing, as if we both understand that this time of day is something special, worth holding on to. The sky is turning a deeper shade of orange now, and the clouds have picked up hues of pink and purple, stretching across the horizon in soft, sweeping strokes. I breathe it all in, the scent of salt and seaweed, the cool breeze on my face, the quiet murmur of the waves, and feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. It's a reminder that sometimes beauty doesn't need to be chased. It's right there in front of you, waiting for you to notice. I keep walking, lost in my thoughts, until I reach the small cove at the end of the beach, where a group of friends has gathered around a small fire. They're laughing, passing around marshmallows, their faces glowing in the warm light of the flames. One of them pulls out a guitar and starts strumming a gentle melody that blends perfectly with the sound of the sea. It feels like a scene out of a dream, and for a moment, I'm tempted to join them, to sit by the fire and share in the warmth and laughter. But instead, I keep walking, giving them a small wave as I pass. They wave back, and I feel the warmth of their friendship from afar, carrying a piece of it with me as I make my way back up the beach. The sun has almost disappeared now, just a sliver of light left on the horizon. The sky is a deep, dusky blue, and the first stars are beginning to peek through, twinkling faintly above the water. I stop for a moment, letting the waves lap around my feet, grounding me in the present. Standing there, watching the last bit of light fade, I feel a calm settle over me. It's as if the ocean, the sky, the sand, everything has come together in perfect harmony, whispering to me to let go, to just be here, in this moment. And so I do. I breathe in deeply, savoring the peace, the beauty, the simple joy of being by the sea at sunset. When I finally turn to head back, the beach is nearly empty, the day coming to its quiet close. I leave with a sense of lightness, a feeling that I'm carrying a piece of the sunset within me, a reminder that there's beauty in simplicity, in stillness, in just being. And as I walk away from the shore, I know I'll be back, drawn to this place, to these colors, this light, and this peace, again and again.